The German invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on 22nd June 1941 under the code name Operation Barbarossa, set the stage for the battle that would engulf Kiev and become the largest encirclement in military history. The city, the capital of Soviet Ukraine, was not only a vital political and cultural center but also a key strategic objective due to its position on the Dnieper River and its role as a hub for railways and industry. Control of Kiev promised the Axis both symbolic value and operational advantage in the broader southern sector of the Eastern Front. In the weeks following the initial invasion, German Army Group South advanced rapidly across Ukraine. Under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, this formation included the 6th Army, 17th Army, and 1st Panzer Group. Their objective was to destroy Soviet forces west of the river, secure the Ukrainian agricultural heartland, and open the way to the industrial Donbass and the oil-rich Caucasus. The Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded initially by General Mikhail Kirponos and later overseen by Marshal Semyon Budyonny as Stavka representative, faced the task of defending Kiev and the approaches to the Dnieper. The Southwestern Front fielded enormous manpower, over 627,000 troops organized into 4 armies by late July 1941, supported by more than 900 tanks and 1,200 aircraft. Despite numerical strength, Soviet forces suffered from serious shortcomings: inadequate communications, poorly coordinated command structures, shortages of modern equipment, and the devastating effects of German air superiority, which disrupted supply and reinforcements. The political context compounded the military strain. For Adolf Hitler, Kiev was a major strategic target, but also a point of debate within the German high command. While Hitler favored securing Ukraine and destroying Soviet forces in the south before turning to Moscow, many Wehrmacht generals, including Heinz Guderian and Fedor von Bock, advocated for a direct advance on the Soviet capital. The eventual decision to prioritize Kiev reflected Hitler's determination to annihilate Soviet field armies in encirclements rather than focusing exclusively on seizing urban centers. For Joseph Stalin and the Soviet leadership, Kiev was a city that could not be abandoned. It was a symbol of Soviet Ukraine and a critical anchor of the Southern Front. The Stavka issued orders to hold the city at all costs, forbidding withdrawals despite mounting evidence that German forces were maneuvering for a major encirclement. Soviet intelligence underestimated the scale of German armored movements and overestimated the ability of defensive positions along the Dnieper to resist prolonged assault. Publicly, Soviet propaganda emphasized the resilience of Kiev's defenders, encouraging both military and civilian populations to prepare for a long battle. As the summer of 1941 wore on, the preconditions for catastrophe were established. German armies pressed steadily closer to the Dnieper, while Soviet forces, though resisting fiercely, suffered heavy losses in men and material. By August, the front around Kiev stretched over hundreds of kilometers, defended by exhausted and undersupplied Soviet divisions. The city itself was fortified with defensive belts, anti-tank ditches, and artillery emplacements, but these preparations could not compensate for the growing operational imbalance. The encirclement that would follow was not inevitable, but the strategic choices on both sides made it increasing. Thus, the context of the battle for Kiev combined geopolitical imperatives, strategic debates within both German and Soviet commands, and the operational realities of the summer 1941 campaign. It was a confrontation shaped not only by the vast forces deployed but also by the political determination of Hitler and Stalin, each unwilling to concede ground. The stage was set for a battle that would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, devastate the Ukrainian capital, and remain one of the most consequential encirclements in the history of warfare. The opening phase of the battle around Kiev began in July 1941, when German Army Group South advanced toward the Dnieper with the goal of seizing crossings and tightening pressure on Soviet defenses. The Sixth Army under General Walter von Reichenau moved directly toward Kiev from the west, while the 17th Army advanced on its southern flank, and the 1st Panzer Group under General Ewald von Kleist drove through central Ukraine with the aim of encircling Soviet formations retreating toward the river. Romanian and Hungarian units provided additional support on the southern wing, securing captured territories and pushing toward the Black Sea coast. The Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos, attempted to delay the German advance with defensive battles across western Ukraine. In early July, engagements near Berdychev, Zhytomyr, and Vinnytsia resulted in heavy losses on both sides. Soviet tank corps, many equipped with older models such as the BT-7 and T-26, launched counterattacks against advancing panzer units. While these efforts inflicted casualties, German armor and combined arms coordination proved superior. Luftwaffe formations maintained dominance in the air, destroying hundreds of Soviet aircraft on the ground and in combat, further limiting Soviet ability to challenge German movements. By mid-July, German forces reached the Irpin River, only a short distance from Kiev itself. Soviet troops established fortified positions west and northwest of the city using anti-tank ditches, minefields, and artillery to strengthen the line. The city's defenders numbered more than 400,000 by this stage, including regular Red Army units, NKVD border guards, and militia formations drawn from the civilian population. Despite shortages of modern equipment, morale remained high, as both the Soviet command and state propaganda emphasized the importance of Kiev as a bastion of resistance in Ukraine. German commanders initially hoped that a swift strike could take Kiev directly. Several assaults launched in late July probed the defenses north of the city. Fierce battles erupted around Irpin and in the forests near Oster, where Soviet defenders used well-prepared positions to repel infantry and tank attacks. The Sixth Army's progress slowed significantly, with casualties mounting. Recognizing the strength of the Soviet positions, German High Command shifted from attempts to storm the city directly to plans for a larger encirclement. While these clashes unfolded, the Soviets sought to stabilize the broader front. Stavka ordered counteroffensives to disrupt the German advance. In early August, Soviet forces launched attacks near Korostin and Uman. The Uman pocket, however, ended in disaster for the Red Army, as more than 100,000 Soviet troops were encircled and captured by German and Romanian forces. This defeat weakened the southern flank of the Southwestern Front and left Kiev increasingly vulnerable. The civilians of Kiev also began to feel the strain of the opening phase. Bombing raids by the Luftwaffe targeted rail stations, supply depots, and bridges, causing significant destruction in the city. Air raid shelters filled nightly, and thousands of residents were mobilized for defense works, digging trenches and building barricades. Despite hardships, the population largely complied with mobilization orders, reinforcing the city's transformation into a fortress. By the end of August 1941, the opening phase had produced a tense stalemate west of Kiev. German forces had failed to seize the city through frontal assault, but Soviet defenses were stretched thin after repeated battles and mounting losses elsewhere on the front. Hitler and the German High Command now faced a choice: whether to continue pressing directly toward Moscow or to commit armored formations northward to link with Army Group Center in an attempt to encircle Kiev on a massive scale. This decision would determine the future course of the campaign and the fate of the hundreds of thousands of troops still holding the Soviet positions around the Ukrainian capital. The strategic decisions leading into the encirclement of Kiev reflected deep divisions within the German command and a critical misjudgment on the Soviet side. After the initial German attempts to seize the city by direct assault faltered in July and August 1941, the Wehrmacht shifted toward a more ambitious plan. The question of how best to employ Germany's armored forces became central to Hitler's thinking, and the arguments within the Oberkommando des Heeres revealed contrasting priorities between seizing Moscow and destroying Soviet armies in the field. On the German side, the High Command debated whether to commit resources toward the central thrust against Moscow or redirect armor southward to close the Kiev pocket. Generals like Heinz Guderian and Fedor von Bock argued that Moscow should be the primary objective, reasoning that the capture of the Soviet capital would deliver a decisive political and logistical blow. Hitler, however, prioritized the destruction of Soviet field armies and the seizure of Ukraine's agricultural and industrial resources. He insisted that Army Group Center divert its armored strength southward to assist Army Group South in a massive encirclement of the Soviet southwestern front. This strategic choice had enormous consequences. In late August 1941, Hitler ordered Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, part of Army Group Center, to wheel south from the Smolensk region toward the Desna River. Simultaneously, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, advancing northward from the Dnieper Bend, was to link up with Guderian near Lochvitsa, thereby cutting off the Soviet forces defending Kiev. Supporting these armored thrusts were the German 2nd Army advancing eastward and the 6th Army pressing from the west, while Romanian units protected the southern flank. The operation required precision and coordination over hundreds of kilometers, but the potential rewards were vast. The encirclement of an entire Soviet front numbering over 500,000 men. The Soviets faced their own strategic dilemmas. By early September, intelligence indicated German armored movements threatening Kiev's flanks. General Mikhail Kirponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, and his chief of staff, General Mikhail Burmistenko, warned Stavka of the danger. They recommended withdrawal from Kiev to avoid encirclement and establish new defensive lines along the Desna and beyond. Marshal Semyon Budyani, appointed as Stalin's representative in the sector, supported these concerns, recognizing that German armored columns advancing from the north and south risked closing a massive trap. Stalin, however, rejected these proposals. Determined to hold Kiev at all costs, he ordered the Southwestern Front to maintain its positions. For Stalin, abandoning Kiev would represent not only a military setback, but also a political humiliation. The city was the capital of Soviet Ukraine and a symbol of resistance. On 11th September, he reiterated his directive: Kiev must be defended to the last. This decision sealed the fate of the Southwestern Front. In preparation for what they believed would be continued frontal attacks, the Soviets fortified Kiev and surrounding areas. Defensive belts extended along the Dnieper, reinforced by artillery and newly mobilized units. By early September, the Southwestern Front had over 627,000 troops, 832 tanks, and more than 900 aircraft in the sector. These forces were formidable in number, but their deployment along a broad defensive arc made them vulnerable to the kind of deep encirclement the Germans were planning. Communications were fragile, coordination between armies was inconsistent, and reserves were insufficient to counter large-scale armored breakthroughs. German planning, in contrast, was focused and coordinated. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, with around 600 tanks, began its southward thrust on 25 August, advancing through Starodub and Konotop toward the Desna crossings. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, with a similar number of tanks, pushed northward from the Kremenchuk bridgehead across the Dnieper. Both formations relied on Luftwaffe support, which targeted Soviet rail lines, bridges, and command centers to paralyze mobility and communication. The intent was to close the trap swiftly, leaving little opportunity for Soviet withdrawal. By the first week of September, the danger to the Southwestern Front was clear. German spearheads advanced rapidly, while Soviet The Red Army attempted to block Guderian's advance at Chernigov and Romny, deploying mechanized corps and infantry divisions. These engagements inflicted some German losses, but could not halt the armored thrust. South of Kiev, Kleist's panzers broke through Soviet lines near Kremenchuk and drove toward Lubny. The encirclement maneuver was now in motion, with German columns pressing closer together each day. Soviet attempts to relieve the situation failed due to poor coordination and shortages of fuel and ammunition. Counteroffensives launched by the Bryansk front against Guderian's flank stalled with heavy losses. Communications between the southwestern front and Stavka deteriorated under constant German airstrikes, leaving commanders at Kiev often unaware of the full scope of the encirclement threat. Civilians in Kiev continued to construct defenses and serve in militia battalions, unaware that the larger strategic picture was turning against them. By mid-September, the German plan was succeeding with devastating precision. On 14 September 1941, Guderian's spearheads advancing from the north met Kleist's panzers driving from the south near the town of Lokvice, east of Kiev. The encirclement was closed, cutting off nearly the entire Soviet southwestern front. More than 600,000 Soviet troops were trapped inside a pocket stretching from Kiev to Poltava and from Kremenchuk to Nizhyn. The largest encirclement in military history had been created. This stage of the battle highlighted the stark contrast between German operational agility and Soviet political rigidity. While German commanders coordinated long-range armored movements supported by concentrated air power, Soviet leaders held their armies in exposed positions due to political directives. The result was the imminent destruction of one of the Red Army's largest concentrations of forces. The decisions made in August and early September directly shaped the catastrophe that followed, setting the stage for weeks of fighting inside the encirclement and the eventual collapse of organized Soviet resistance around Kiev. The clash around Kiev in September 1941 began with a series of intense engagements as German forces sought to tighten their encirclement and Soviet defenders attempted to break free. Once Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group advancing from the north and Kleist's 1st Panzer Group pushing from the south linked up near Lokvice on 14th of September, the trap was effectively sealed. Nearly the entire Soviet southwestern front, 4 armies with hundreds of thousands of men, found themselves cut off in a pocket extending more than 200 kilometers in length and 100 kilometers in depth. What followed was a desperate struggle marked by continuous battles, shifting lines, and immense suffering for both soldiers and civilians caught within the encirclement. At the outset of the encirclement, Soviet forces inside the pocket numbered over 600,000 men, supported by thousands of artillery pieces and several hundred tanks, though many were older models and lacked fuel or ammunition. Command of the pocket rested with General Mikhail Kirponos, but his ability to coordinate was rapidly undermined by the breakdown of communications. German airstrikes destroyed telephone lines, while radio networks proved unreliable under constant jamming and bombing. Orders from Stavka were delayed or contradictory, leaving local commanders to act on incomplete information. Despite these difficulties, Soviet troops fought with determination, attempting to organize counterattacks and escape routes. German forces moved quickly to reduce the pocket. Infantry divisions from the 6th Army pressed from the west, while the 2nd Army attacked from the northeast. Panzer units, having closed the trap, pivoted inward to prevent Soviet breakouts. The Luftwaffe maintained near-total air superiority, conducting hundreds of sorties daily against retreating columns, artillery positions, and supply depots. Bombing raids created chaos on roads crowded with soldiers and civilians, disrupting attempts to regroup. In the northern sector of the pocket, Soviet forces launched counterattacks near Nizhyn and Bakhmach, hoping to reopen corridors to the east. Several divisions attempted coordinated advances, but were repeatedly halted by German defenses and air power. South of Kiev, Soviet troops fought around Kremenchuk and Lubny in an effort to break through to the Dnieper, but German infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, repelled each attempt. Lacking sufficient fuel, Soviet armored units often abandoned vehicles after limited engagements, leaving crews to fight on foot. The impact on civilians was immediate and severe. Kiev, already under bombardment for weeks, endured intensified air raids. Fires consumed entire districts, while thousands of residents sought refuge in basements, shelters, and underground tunnels. Many civilians were mobilized into labor battalions to support the army, constructing barricades, digging trenches, and carrying supplies under fire. Others fled eastward in chaotic columns, only to be caught within the tightening German cordon. Casualties among non-combatants mounted as artillery and airstrikes struck populated areas without distinction. Morale within the encircled Soviet armies fluctuated as the situation worsened. Some units maintained cohesion, conducting organized retreats and counterattacks to cover fellow divisions. Others disintegrated under pressure, with soldiers dispersing into forests or surrendering when supplies ran out. Commanders struggled to balance the need to preserve fighting strength with Stalin's orders to hold Kiev at all costs. On 15th of September, General Kirponos and his staff attempted to coordinate a breakout to the east, but delays and confusion hampered execution. By the time orders reached subordinate units, German positions had already been reinforced. German accounts from this phase describe constant fighting along every road and river line inside the pocket. Soviet forces, though cut off, resisted fiercely, launching night raids, ambushes, and small-scale attacks that inflicted casualties and slowed the Axis advance. In some sectors, German divisions reported daily losses in the hundreds as they fought through determined defenses. Romanian and Hungarian units, assigned to hold parts of the southern cordon, also faced heavy resistance, with Soviet troops exploiting weaknesses in their lines to stage local breakouts before being driven back by German reinforcements. By 17th to 18th September, the encirclement was fully consolidated. German divisions tightened their control over the pocket, systematically advancing to split it into smaller sections. Encircled Soviet armies found themselves increasingly isolated, their supply lines exhausted, and ammunition nearly depleted. Civilians trapped within the shrinking perimeter suffered alongside the soldiers, enduring hunger, thirst, and bombardment, without means of escape. The early clashes of the Kiev pocket revealed both the determination of the Soviet defenders and the overwhelming coordination of the German assault. Soviet attempts to escape were courageous, but poorly supported and hampered by lack of fuel, ammunition, and effective command. German forces, meanwhile, exploited their superior mobility, artillery, and air power to contain one of the largest concentrations of enemy troops ever encircled. The stage was set for a brutal process of reduction. The battle within the Kiev pocket escalated sharply after 18th September 1941 as German and Romanian forces pressed inward to break down the vast Soviet encirclement into smaller, more manageable sectors. The Soviet Southwestern Front, still numbering over 500,000 men, attempted to resist and break out, but the combination of German mobility, artillery superiority, and air dominance steadily crushed organized resistance. What began as defensive battles on the perimeter soon turned into desperate struggles for survival. German strategy during this stage was methodical. The Sixth Army advanced from the west, the Second Army from the northeast, while Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Kleist's 1st Panzer Group pivoted inward to hold the northern and southern shoulders of the encirclement. Infantry formations were ordered to drive eastward in coordinated assaults, splitting the pocket into smaller compartments. Luftwaffe units under General Wolfram von Richthofen flew hundreds of sorties each day, striking retreating Soviet columns, ammunition depots, and attempted breakout routes. Soviet soldiers reported being under constant bombardment, with columns scattered and artillery silenced by precision raids. Inside the pocket, General Kirponos and his staff faced mounting crises. Communications with Stavka were intermittent, often cut by German bombardment. On 18th September, Stavka finally authorized withdrawal from Kiev, but the order came too late. German pincers had already closed firmly, and viable escape routes no longer existed. Kirponos attempted to organize a breakout toward the east along the Sel and Sula rivers, concentrating what remained of Soviet mechanized forces to spearhead the movement. However, shortages of fuel and ammunition crippled these. Soviet counterattacks nonetheless erupted in several sectors. On 19th and 20th September, units of the Fifth Army attempted to push northeast toward Chernigov. Though they managed temporary breakthroughs against Hungarian and German infantry divisions, they were quickly sealed off by German reserves. South of Kiev, formations of the 37th Army attempted to cross the Dnieper to escape, but German artillery and Luftwaffe strikes inflicted devastating casualties on crowded crossing points. Thousands of soldiers drowned as pontoon bridges collapsed under attack, and only small groups reached the eastern bank. Civilian conditions deteriorated rapidly. With the city under constant bombardment and German artillery shells striking residential areas, food supplies dwindled to nothing. Civilians still in Kiev, tens of thousands unable to evacuate earlier, found themselves trapped in a besieged city. Some assisted in defensive operations, manning barricades or carrying ammunition. Others sought shelter in underground cellars or caves. Fires spread through entire districts, and hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and non-combatants. Civilians fleeing eastward with retreating soldiers were caught in the same bombardments, further adding to the humanitarian disaster. Morale among Soviet troops weakened as the scale of the encirclement became undeniable. While some divisions fought tenaciously, launching counterattacks and defending villages to the last, others fragmented under pressure. Desertions and surrenders increased, particularly among exhausted units cut off from commanders. German reports describe capturing thousands of prisoners in single sweeps as Soviet formations disintegrated. Yet other Soviet units maintained cohesion to the end, resisting from fortified positions and forcing German infantry to clear them with close quarters fighting. On 20th September, General Kirponos himself was killed near Lochwitza while attempting to lead elements of the Fifth Army in a breakout. His death symbolized the collapse of organized command within the pocket. Surviving staff officers attempted to regroup remaining forces, but by then, German infantry had advanced deep into the encircled zone, capturing towns such as Lubny and Preluki and isolating Soviet divisions into separate pockets. By 22nd September, large parts of the southwestern front were no longer functioning as cohesive armies, but as scattered groups of soldiers fighting independently. German and Romanian forces faced their own strain during this stage. Casualties mounted as Soviet troops fought fiercely in defensive battles around forests, river crossings, and fortified villages. Reports noted heavy German losses in close-quarter engagements where Soviet soldiers, deprived of heavy weapons, relied on rifles, grenades, and bayonets. The destruction of Soviet formations was far from effortless. Each advance required systematic bombardment, infantry assaults, and the commitment of reserves. Still, the operational advantage lay firmly with the encircling armies, which retained freedom of movement and supply, while Soviet forces were starved of both. By the last week of September, the Kiev pocket had been reduced dramatically. From an initial encirclement holding over 600,000 men, tens of thousands had been killed in combat or bombardment, while hundreds of thousands more were cut off in fragmented pockets awaiting capture. German intelligence estimated that over 300,000 prisoners had already been taken by 25 September, with more surrendering daily. The great battle for Kiev was shifting from large-scale maneuvers to the systematic liquidation of the remaining Soviet resistance. The escalation of fighting inside the pocket underscored the catastrophic consequences of strategic miscalculation. The Soviet decision to hold Kiev until it was too late to withdraw transformed the defense of the city into one of the most destructive encirclements in history. As the Germans pressed their advantage, the southwestern front ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, and the fate of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers now depended only on the speed of German advances and their own ability to resist in scattered formations. By late September 1941, the battle for Kiev reached its peak. The once cohesive Soviet southwestern front had been shattered into isolated pockets, each surrounded by German divisions pressing inward from every direction. The scale of fighting was immense, as hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops tried to resist or escape. For the Germans, This stage was about finishing the encirclement, systematically destroying Soviet formations, and taking prisoners in numbers unprecedented in modern warfare. The German Sixth Army advanced steadily from the west, tightening its grip on the approaches to Kiev itself. To the northeast, the Second Army closed off escape routes along the Desna, while Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Kleist's 1st Panzer Group continued driving inward, forming successive inner rings of encirclement. Infantry divisions mopped up villages and strongpoints, while armored units struck deeper, splitting the pocket into smaller sectors. By 23-24 September, German forces had reduced the pocket to several clusters of Soviet troops still fighting near towns such as Lochvitsa, Romny, and Priluki. Soviet soldiers fought desperately to resist annihilation. Many divisions had little ammunition left, with some artillery batteries reduced to only a few shells per gun. Tank crews often disabled their vehicles to prevent capture, fighting on foot with small arms. Counterattacks were launched in multiple directions, especially along the Sula River, as scattered units attempted to break through to the east. Most of these efforts ended in failure under the weight of German artillery and air bombardment. Still, resistance was determined. In some cases, Soviet units fought to the last man, forcing German infantry into costly close-quarter battles in forests and villages. The Luftwaffe played a decisive role during this peak stage. Richthofen's Fliegerkorps E8 concentrated its efforts on the shrinking Soviet pocket, flying hundreds of missions daily. Columns of retreating soldiers were bombed relentlessly, while bridges and river crossings were destroyed to block any breakout attempts. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses were virtually gone, and the Red Air Force in the region was unable to contest German air supremacy. This left Soviet troops exposed and further undermined their ability to maneuver. Inside Kiev itself, the situation had become catastrophic. The city was heavily bombarded by both artillery and air raids, with fires destroying residential areas, warehouses, and government buildings. Water and electricity were cut, and food stocks had been largely consumed or destroyed. Civilians still in the city, tens of thousands who had been unable to evacuate, suffered immensely. Many hid in cellars, caves, or the city's catacombs. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians alike, while medical supplies ran out. Despite the chaos, militia units and volunteers continued to man barricades and assist the army, though they were increasingly ineffective against the overwhelming German assault. The Germans recorded large-scale surrenders during this stage. Exhausted and without supplies, entire Soviet regiments and divisions laid down their arms. On 26-27 September, German forces reported capturing tens of thousands of prisoners in a single day, bringing the total far beyond 400,000. Yet the process of reducing the pocket was not without cost. German divisions reported heavy casualties in clearing operations, particularly against Soviet positions that resisted until completely destroyed. Romanian troops on the southern flank also suffered significant losses, as Soviet units tried repeatedly to cut their way out toward the Dnieper crossings. By the end of September, the Soviet command structure had collapsed entirely. After the death of General Mikhail Kirponos on 20 September, remaining staff officers were captured or killed in fragmented breakout attempts. Coordination between Soviet units was virtually non-existent, with groups of soldiers acting independently, guided only by survival or attempts to escape eastward. The once powerful Southwestern Front, with over 600,000 men at the beginning of the battle, now existed only as scattered remnants. For the Germans, the peak of the battle delivered both a triumph and a logistical burden. The sheer number of prisoners, eventually totaling around 665,000, overwhelmed transportation and security systems. German divisions had to divert troops to guard columns of prisoners marching westward, stretching supply lines further. Captured Soviet equipment included more than 3,500 guns and 600 tanks, adding to the scale of the victory. Still, the operational achievement was undeniable. The destruction of an entire Soviet front and the capture of one of the largest cities in Ukraine. Thus, by the close of September, yet the cost of the operation, the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Kiev, and the strategic consequences of diverting armored forces southward would shape the next stage of the war in profound ways. After the collapse of organized Soviet command in the Kiev pocket, the battle shifted into a phase defined by scattered resistance, improvisation, and desperate adaptation. Though the Southwestern Front had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent formation by late September 1941, many units and smaller groups of soldiers continued to fight, attempting to delay German advances, break through the encirclement, or simply survive. This stage highlighted the persistence of resistance even in the face of overwhelming odds, as well as the adjustments both sides made to contend with a battlefield unlike any they had experienced before. For the Soviets, adaptation meant relying on fragmented formations. Divisions that had been cut into smaller groups reorganized themselves into ad hoc detachments, often commanded by junior officers or even non-commissioned leaders after senior staff were killed or captured. Soldiers lacking heavy weapons relied on rifles, grenades, and machine guns scavenged from abandoned positions. Some groups used the dense forests and river valleys east of Kiev to stage ambushes against German patrols, inflicting local casualties before dispersing. Others dug into villages or fortified positions, holding out as long as possible to cover the retreat of comrades attempting breakouts. The most determined efforts at adaptation came in the form of breakout attempts. From 22 to 26 September, scattered Soviet groups tried to cross German lines along the Sula and Psel rivers. Without coordinated artillery or armor, these movements relied on night marches and surprise attacks. A few small units managed to slip through gaps, reaching Soviet lines to the east, but the majority were intercepted and destroyed. Fuel shortages ensured that most tanks and trucks were abandoned, forcing infantry to move on foot across terrain dominated by German mechanized forces. The Luftwaffe added to the difficulty by strafing and bombing any columns spotted in daylight. Partisan activity began to take root during this period, as some soldiers and civilians refused to surrender and instead dispersed into forests around the Dnieper basin. Though initially unorganized, these groups laid the foundation for later partisan warfare in Ukraine, targeting German supply convoys, bridges, and isolated garrisons. For the Germans, the emergence of such resistance underscored that the battle would not end. On the German side, resistance inside the pocket forced tactical changes. Rather than facing large uniform formations, German divisions now had to conduct clearing operations against numerous small mobile groups. This meant dividing units into smaller detachments, patrolling forests, and engaging in close-quarter combat in villages and fields. Reports from the 6th Army noted that the liquidation of the Kiev pocket required systematic house-to-house fighting in some areas, as Soviet holdouts refused to surrender even when cut off and out of ammunition. Romanian and Hungarian units were tasked with holding rear areas and guarding prisoners, but their lower equipment standards and heavy casualties sometimes left them vulnerable to sudden Soviet counterblows. Civilians, too, adapted to the collapse. With the city of Kiev already in ruins and under German control, those still trapped in the countryside faced starvation and constant danger from bombardments and sweeps. Some civilians attempted to flee eastward alongside retreating Soviet soldiers, while others tried to hide in remote villages. Many were caught up in reprisals as German troops suspected local populations of aiding Soviet holdouts or partisans. The population thus endured the dual strain of military defeat and the onset of a harsh occupation regime. Psychologically, the situation was starkly different for both sides. For Soviet soldiers, survival and loyalty to comrades replaced broader operational objectives. Accounts describe units fighting on despite hopeless odds, motivated by duty, discipline, or simply the determination not to surrender. For German troops, the battle had become one of attrition, with the focus shifting from maneuver warfare to exhausting sweeps of terrain against desperate opponents. Though German morale was buoyed by the scale of the victory, the exhausting nature of these operations and the mounting casualties highlighted the human cost of even successful encirclements. By the end of September 1941, resistance inside the Kiev pocket had largely been crushed, but the adaptation shown by Soviet soldiers ensured that the process was neither easy nor bloodless for the Germans. The battle illustrated how a destroyed army could continue to resist in fragmented form, delaying enemy consolidation and laying the groundwork for irregular warfare. It also exposed the limitations of German planning, as the Wehrmacht had to devote extensive manpower and resources to secure an area that it had already considered captured. The Kiev encirclement, though a decisive German operational success, revealed the resilience of Soviet resistance and the adaptability of armies forced into catastrophic situations. The turning point of the battle for Kiev came in the final week of September 1941, when the encircled Soviet armies, shattered by constant bombardment and cut off from supplies, collapsed as organized forces. What had begun as one of the largest concentrations of Red Army strength turned into a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The outcome of the encirclement shaped the remainder of the 1941 campaign in the South and stood as one of the most consequential defeats in Soviet military history. By 25 September, the German Sixth Army had entered Kiev itself. The city, already devastated by weeks of air raids and artillery bombardments, offered little organized resistance. Most defenders had either been withdrawn earlier to reinforce the outer lines or were already trapped in the pocket. German infantry pushed through ruined streets, encountering sporadic fire from militia units and small detachments of Soviet soldiers unwilling to surrender. By 26 September, Kiev was fully under German control. In the days immediately following the occupation, fires erupted across the city, some caused by combat damage and others by scorched earth measures implemented by retreating Soviet engineers. German records indicate that explosives left in key buildings detonated after the occupation, destroying headquarters and barracks, and causing hundreds of German casualties. Outside the city, the larger battle raged as German forces moved to crush the encircled Soviet armies. By this point, more than 600,000 Soviet troops were trapped between the Dnieper and Desna rivers. Food stocks were exhausted, artillery ammunition was nearly gone, and many units had no functioning heavy weapons. The Luftwaffe continued to pound retreating columns, destroying bridges, striking river crossings, and scattering soldiers across open terrain. German infantry and armor advanced systematically, cutting the pocket into smaller segments and forcing mass surrenders. The largest engagements of this stage took place along the Sel and Sula rivers, where remnants of the 5th and 37th Armies attempted breakouts. These battles often lasted only hours before collapsing under overwhelming German firepower. In one attempt near Lochwitza, thousands of Soviet troops charged German positions with minimal artillery support, only to be annihilated by concentrated machine gun and mortar fire. Other groups managed to break through temporarily, but without coordination or reserves, they were quickly recaptured or destroyed. German reports describe capturing entire divisions in single actions, with columns of thousands of prisoners marching westward under guard. The loss of senior Soviet leadership further accelerated the collapse. General Mikhail Kirponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, was killed on 20 September in a firefight while attempting to lead a breakout. His death left the encircled troops without central direction. Surviving commanders issued contradictory orders, some urging breakout attempts, others ordering soldiers to dig in and fight to the last. Communication with Stavka was almost non-existent, leaving soldiers in the pocket isolated and increasingly demoralized. German casualty reports from this phase indicate heavy fighting, despite the scale of Soviet collapse. Infantry units engaged in clearing operations recorded hundreds of losses as Soviet soldiers resisted to the last in forests, villages, and even trenches dug hastily in open fields. The German Sixth Army and Second Army, supported by panzer groups, had to commit large numbers of troops to mop up operations, slowing the pace of encirclement reduction. Romanian units, tasked with covering southern flanks and participating in clearing actions, sustained thousands of casualties as Soviet troops tried repeatedly to break south toward the Dnieper. By 30th of September, the Soviet pocket had been liquidated. German claims reported the capture of approximately 665,000 prisoners, alongside the destruction or seizure of 3,718 artillery pieces and 884 tanks. Soviet sources acknowledged the loss of more than 600,000 personnel in total, including killed, wounded, and captured, making the battle one of the single largest encirclements in military history. These figures far surpassed earlier encirclements at Bialystok, Minsk, and Smolensk, establishing Kiev as the most devastating loss suffered by the Red Army in 1941. For civilians, the turning point brought no relief. The occupation of Kiev marked the beginning of severe repression. Thousands were arrested as suspected partisans or collaborators. Within days of German occupation, explosions in the city center, caused by Soviet demolition charges, destroyed buildings and killed German soldiers, prompting harsh reprisals. The Jewish population of Kiev, numbering tens of thousands, was subjected to immediate persecution. Within a week of occupation, German authorities and SS units carried out the mass execution at Babi Yar, where more than 33,000 people were killed over 2 days, marking one of the earliest and largest massacres of the Holocaust. The strategic repercussions of the battle were immediate. The destruction of the southwestern front removed the Red Army's main defensive force in Ukraine. The Germans now had a clear path into the Donbass industrial region and toward the lower Dnieper. Army Group South, freed from the burden of Kiev, advanced rapidly into eastern Ukraine in October, seizing Kharkov by late October and threatening Rostov. For the Wehrmacht, the battle was celebrated as a triumph of encirclement warfare, confirming Hitler's emphasis on destroying Soviet armies in the field rather than advancing directly to Moscow. Yet the turning point also contained the seeds of later difficulties. The diversion of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group southward to help encircle Kiev delayed the German advance on Moscow by several crucial weeks. When Operation Typhoon, the drive on the Soviet capital, began in October, it encountered worsening weather, stiffened Soviet defenses, and ultimately the counteroffensive before Moscow in December. Thus, the victory at Kiev, while enormous, indirectly contributed to the failure of the German campaign in 1941. The battle's turning point revealed the dual nature of the Kiev encirclement. For the Soviets, it was a disaster of monumental proportions, stripping the Red Army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and opening the southern front. For the Germans, it was both the pinnacle of operational success and a decision that stretched their resources thin at a critical moment. The destruction of the Soviet southwestern front was complete, but the war itself was far from decided. The aftermath of the Battle for Kiev in late September 1941 was as catastrophic as the encirclement itself. Once the German and Romanian armies completed the reduction of the pocket, the Soviet southwestern front ceased to exist as an operational force. The consequences were felt not only on the battlefield, but also in the humanitarian disaster that followed, in the political reverberations across both Berlin and Moscow, and in the subsequent campaigns that the victory made possible. By early October 1941, German reports claimed that approximately 665,000 Soviet soldiers had been captured in the Kiev operation. Alongside the prisoners, the Wehrmacht seized nearly 900 tanks, over 3,700 artillery pieces, and vast quantities of equipment and supplies. The number of killed and wounded among the Soviet forces inside the pocket remains difficult to determine precisely, but estimates range from 130,000 to 150,000. In total, the Soviet Union lost close to 750,000 men in the destruction of the Southwestern Front. It was the largest single encirclement in military history, and a devastating blow to the Red Army in the first months of the war. The fate of the prisoners was grim. Forced marches began almost immediately, as German divisions moved tens of thousands of captives westward toward improvised camps. With limited transport available, prisoners were made to walk for days with minimal food or water. Many collapsed along the roadside and were left behind. Camps hastily established without adequate shelter or supplies, disease and starvation spread rapidly. Mortality among Soviet prisoners of war in the autumn and winter of 1941 was catastrophic, with hundreds of thousands perishing across the Eastern Front. Those captured at Kiev contributed heavily to these figures. For the city of Kiev itself, the consequences of occupation were immediate and severe. German troops entered the capital on 19th of September, and while the battle was still ongoing in the countryside, the Wehrmacht secured administrative control. Within days, however, a series of explosions devastated the city center. Soviet NKVD units, retreating before the German advance, had left behind timed charges in buildings and infrastructure. These detonations destroyed entire blocks, killed hundreds of German soldiers, and left parts of the city in ruins. German authorities responded with mass arrests and reprisals, further terrorizing the civilian population. The most infamous atrocity followed soon after, the massacre at Babi Yar. On 29 to 30 September 1941, German SS and police units, assisted by auxiliary forces, executed over 33,000 Jews in a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev. This marked one of the largest mass killings of the Holocaust up to that point and demonstrated the fusion of military occupation with genocidal policy. In the weeks that followed, tens of thousands of additional victims, including Soviet prisoners of war, partisans, and civilians accused of resistance, were killed at the same site. For Kiev's civilian population, the aftermath of the battle was thus not only devastation from combat, but also systematic repression and mass murder under occupation. On the German side, the victory at Kiev was hailed as a triumph. Hitler proclaimed it the greatest victory in history, and the numbers seem to confirm this boast. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South had destroyed an entire Soviet front, and Hitler awarded promotions and decorations to commanders involved. General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group were credited with executing one of the most successful encirclement maneuvers ever achieved. For the Wehrmacht, Kiev validated the doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, demonstrating that deep armored thrusts supported by air power could annihilate massive enemy forces. Yet the costs and consequences of the operation tempered the triumph. The diversion of armored groups southward delayed the start of Operation Typhoon, the offensive toward Moscow, by several weeks. The encirclement consumed enormous resources. Panzer divisions needed refitting after weeks of continuous combat, infantry formations suffered heavy casualties in clearing operations, and logistical networks were stretched thin by the requirement to guard and transport hundreds of thousands of prisoners. When German forces finally turned toward Moscow in early October, they did so later in the season than planned, facing deteriorating weather and stiffened Soviet defenses. The delay caused by Kiev played a significant role in the eventual failure of the German advance on the Soviet capital. For the Soviets, the loss of Kiev was a disaster of staggering proportions, but it also carried strategic lessons. Stalin's refusal to authorize a withdrawal, despite repeated warnings from the front, had doomed the Southwestern Front. The death of General Kirponos and the capture of nearly all senior commanders left the Red Army in Ukraine decapitated. Yet the Soviet state adapted quickly. New fronts were formed with fresh reserves drawn from the interior, and Soviet propaganda emphasized not the defeat itself, but the necessity of eventual revenge. The disaster underscored to Stalin the dangers of rigid political directives overriding military necessity, a lesson that gradually influenced Soviet command decisions in later battles. The civilian population of Ukraine bore immense hardship in the aftermath. Occupation authorities implemented harsh policies, food requisitioning, forced labor, and reprisals against suspected partisans. The loss of Kiev also meant the loss of one of the Soviet Union's largest industrial and cultural centers, further straining the war economy. At the same time, the brutality of German occupation fueled the growth of partisan movements across Ukraine, as survivors of the Encirclement and civilians joined resistance groups in forests and rural areas. Thus, the immediate aftermath of the battle presented a stark contrast. For Germany, it was a military success of unprecedented proportions, but one that consumed resources and time they could ill afford. For the Soviet Union, it was a calamity that destroyed one of their largest armies and opened the way to the Donbass and the lower Dnieper, yet it also hardened resolve and contributed to the emergence of resistance. For the civilians of Kiev and Ukraine, it marked the beginning of years of repression, violence, and suffering under occupation. By October 1941, the Kiev encirclement had reshaped the southern front of the war. German forces surged eastward, capturing Kharkov by late October and threatening Rostov by November. The Red Army reeled from the loss, but began the process of rebuilding new fronts further east. The largest encirclement in history had ended, but its consequences, military, political, and human, would reverberate far beyond the battlefields of Ukraine. It was both a pinnacle of German operational success and the opening of some of the darkest chapters of the war in the East. The legacy of the battle for Kiev was shaped not only by its immense scale, but also by the long-term consequences it imposed on both Germany and the Soviet Union. The encirclement of September 1941 remains the largest of its kind in military history, with over 600,000 Soviet soldiers trapped, most of whom were killed or captured. Yet its historical significance extends far beyond the numbers. It reshaped the southern front of the war, influenced the course of Operation Barbarossa, and left enduring political and cultural scars. For the German Wehrmacht, Kiev represented the pinnacle of operational encirclement warfare. The coordination of panzer groups under Guderian and Kleist, supported by infantry armies and Luftwaffe air superiority, demonstrated the effectiveness of German military doctrine in 1941. Hitler held the victory up as proof of his strategic genius, claiming that the destruction of the Soviet southwestern front confirmed his belief in annihilating enemy forces rather than focusing solely on seizing territory. The battle was celebrated in German propaganda as the greatest victory in history, boosting morale among soldiers and civilians alike. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and other commanders were decorated, and the Wehrmacht's reputation for operational brilliance reached its peak. However, the very scale of the success carried hidden costs. The diversion of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group southward to complete the Kiev encirclement delayed the launch of Operation Typhoon against Moscow by nearly 3 weeks. When the offensive finally began in early October, the Wehrmacht encountered worsening autumn weather, extended supply lines, and a Soviet defense already reinforced by reserves from the Far East. Historians continue to debate whether the delay at Kiev directly caused the German failure before Moscow, but the connection between the two events remains clear. The triumph in Ukraine contributed to overextension at the decisive moment in the central sector. For the Soviet Union, Kiev was both a disaster and a turning point. The loss of the southwestern front eliminated one of the Red Army's largest concentrations of forces, opening Ukraine to rapid German advances. Stalin's refusal to authorize withdrawal, despite repeated warnings from front commanders, demonstrated the dangers of political interference in military decisions. Yet the defeat also forced adaptation. In the months that followed, the Soviet command restructured its approach, eventually allowing for greater operational flexibility and the buildup of reserve armies that would play decisive roles at Moscow and later at Stalingrad. The human cost was immense. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners, endured death marches, starvation, or execution, while the destruction of Kiev marked the beginning of a brutal occupation across Ukraine. Civilians carried the heaviest burden in the aftermath. The mass executions at Babi Yar within days of the German occupation of Kiev highlighted the genocidal policies that accompanied military conquest. For the population of Ukraine, the Encirclement battle marked the beginning of years of deprivation, forced labor, and terror. At the same time, the brutality of occupation fueled the growth of partisan movements, many of which drew directly from survivors of the Kiev encirclement and civilians displaced by the fighting. These movements would grow into a significant factor in the later stages of the war. The memory of Kiev shaped post-war narratives in profound ways. In the Soviet Union, the battle was remembered both as a tragedy and as a demonstration of sacrifice. Official accounts emphasized the heroism of defenders and the suffering of civilians, framing the loss as part of the broader story of Soviet resilience. In Germany, the victory at Kiev was later recognized as a hollow success, spectacular in numbers but strategically flawed. The operation became an example of how tactical brilliance could undermine strategic goals by consuming time and resources needed elsewhere. Today, the battle for Kiev stands as a stark reminder of the scale and brutality of the Eastern Front. It demonstrated the devastating potential of mechanized encirclement warfare, the catastrophic consequences of rigid political directives, and the human cost of total war. Its legacy is not only military but also humanitarian and cultural. The destruction of armies, the suffering of civilians, and the enduring memory of one of the darkest episodes of 1941. In the long arc of the Second World War, Kiev remains a symbol of both the Wehrmacht's greatest battlefield success and the Soviet Union's capacity to endure catastrophic losses before ultimately turning the tide of the war.